They pulled up in an unmarked car, badges flashing, claiming to be tool code enforcement. Karen Whitlock stood behind them, arms crossed like she'd just won the lottery. They said I had 15 minutes to hand over my gear. But what they didn't know, I'm a certified fire investigator with the state since 2007, and I know exactly what a real badge looks like. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I've spent the last 18 years working as a certified fire investigator for the state. I don't rattle easy. I've walked into buildings still smoldering from electrical faults. I've combed through ash for accelerants. I've testified in arson trials where someone's future hung on whether I noticed a single scorch pattern. So when 3 strangers showed up on my driveway waving fake credentials, let's just say, I wasn't about to blink. But this wasn't about fire codes. It was about tools. See, when I moved into this little cul-de-sac in Maple Hollow Estates 2 years ago, I kept to myself. I installed a secure shed, welded my own tool bench, and finally had space for the equipment I used on contract jobs and fire assessments. That shed, steel frame, anchored base, fully compliant, became a problem the day Karen Whitlock got elected HOA vice chair. Suddenly, it was a visibility issue. Then it was a non-conforming workspace. Then one morning, it was unlicensed commercial storage. Only, it wasn't. What they tried to do wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. I've seen communities weaponized like this before. Rules twisted, authority faked, pressure applied until people fold. But I didn't move here to fold. I moved here to retire in peace. And if they thought they could intimidate me, they picked the wrong guy with the wrong badge. Where are you watching from? Have you ever had someone try to use fake power to push you around? Drop your state in the comments, and let me know if you've dealt with an HOA like this. Because sometimes knowing the law is all it takes to shut it down. When I first drove into Maple Hollow Estates on a warm April afternoon in 2023, it felt like the kind of place you'd see in a municipal brochure. Tree-lined streets, carefully spaced lanterns, and a little stone monument at the entrance that read, "A Neighborhood in Harmony." The HOA had even planted daffodils around it, bright yellow heads bobbing in the breeze like it was some kind of storybook. I was 51. Semi-retired. After nearly 2 decades investigating fires, chemical violations, and structural fraud across 3 counties, I'd decided to scale back and live a quieter life. No more late-night calls, no more death scenes, just a tidy house, a well-built shed for my tools, and weekends to finally restore the old '85 Harley I'd been towing around since college. I bought a modest single-story ranch-style house at the end of Ashwood Loop. It backed up against greenbelt land and was shaded by 2 tall maples. The shed was the first thing I built, steel-reinforced, bolted into concrete footings, perfectly in line with city code. I even checked with zoning to make sure. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, fireproof, and locked up tighter than most department storage units. That shed would house the specialized equipment I still used on occasional consulting gigs: heat sensors, calibration gear, forensic kits, and yes, some pretty serious power tools. The neighbors waved when I moved in. Patricia and Tom across the street brought over banana bread. A retired teacher lived next door and complimented my roses. People were quiet, respectful. For a while it felt like I'd finally found a place where nobody wanted anything but peace. Even Karen Whitlock, the woman 2 doors down, was polite at first. Tall, neat blonde hair, sunglasses always perched like a crown. She offered me a packet of HOA bylaws with a little smile and said, "Just so you're ahead of the game." It seemed friendly enough. She called the neighborhood a tight-knit little ecosystem. I thanked her, filed the papers, and thought nothing of it. For the first 6 months, everything was smooth. I added shutters to the front windows, reseeded the lawn, and even joined the weekend trash cleanup. I kept my tools out of sight. No loud projects, no driveway clutter. I didn't host barbecues, didn't play music past 9, didn't even use my circular saw before noon. By autumn, I'd fallen into a peaceful rhythm. Mornings started with black coffee and a walk around the block. Most people nodded hello. A few stopped to ask about fire safety tips. Can a dryer really explode? Or, what's the deal with lithium batteries? That's the kind of thing I like. Quiet utility. Helping people solve problems before they catch fire. Literally. That fall, I helped Patricia install smoke alarms after a fuse tripped in her kitchen. I rewired an elderly neighbor's garage light after he nearly fell trying to fix it himself. No one paid me for any of this. I didn't want money. I just wanted to be useful. But I noticed something curious starting in late October. Karen stopped waving. She used to nod when she passed me walking the dog, but now, eyes forward, jaw set. She began pausing in front of my driveway when I was working inside the shed, standing there a little too long before continuing on. Once, I caught her peeking through the slats in my fence, not dramatic, just enough to be noticed. I brushed it off. Maybe she was just nosy. Every neighborhood has one. But then came the first reminder notice from the HOA, folded neatly and stuck in my mailbox. No date. No signature. Just a typed note. Please ensure all outbuildings are in accordance with HOA-approved design standards. This includes visual compliance and usage declaration. MHE-HOA. I checked the bylaws, again. My shed was compliant. It sat 10 feet from the property line, under the maximum height, and painted a neutral gray to match the home. I'd even pulled the permit from the city archives before I poured the foundation. There was nothing in the language about usage declaration, so I ignored it. A week later, a second notice came. This one was labeled a non-conforming use advisory. Resident is advised that the structure at rear southeast quadrant of parcel number 417-294 may constitute unapproved utility function. Submit clarification and intent of use to HOA board within 10 business days. That's when my gut kicked in. Not because I was in the wrong, but because the language had changed. Quadrant. Utility function. That wasn't homeowner talk. That was enforcement lingo. It was as if someone had shifted from neighbor to adversary overnight, and behind that shift, I could feel Karen's influence. The font was the same as the bylaws she gave me. The wording matched her style, formal, clipped, passive-aggressive with a smile. Still, I played it cool. I responded with a letter. The structure in question is a permitted code-compliant toolshed used exclusively for residential maintenance and consulting storage. No industrial or commercial activity is being conducted. I trust this resolves the matter. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In early December 2023, I received a notice of administrative non-compliance. This one came on HOA letterhead, with Karen's name typed at the bottom. Not signed, just typed. The notice claimed my shed housed industrial equipment incompatible with residential zoning aesthetics and listed several alleged code violations, none of which applied to me. But the key phrase, subject to abatement pending inspection. Abatement. That's legal speak for we're coming to seize it. Which brought me to that Friday morning in January when 3 strangers showed up in my driveway with fake badges, a clipboard, and zero legal authority. But that moment, the one where my tools were nearly taken, where Karen smiled from the sidewalk like a queen about to cut the ribbon, that moment wouldn't have happened if not for the peace that came before it, that calm, that trust, that sense that I had finally arrived somewhere quiet, only to realize I'd built my home inside a cage, one run by people who think paper power makes them kings. They wanted control, but they didn't expect a man who reads fire for a living to read through them just as easily. And they definitely didn't expect what came next. They wanted control, but they didn't expect a man who reads fire for a living to read through them just as easily. And they definitely didn't expect what came next. Let's talk about Karen Whitlock. Before the HOA letters, before the fake citations, before the sudden drive-by inspections, Karen seemed like the kind of person you could borrow sugar from. Polished, polite, never raised her voice. Her yard was spotless, not a single leaf out of place. Her rose bushes were trimmed at perfect angles. Even her garbage bins looked like they were positioned with a measuring tape. When I moved in, she was all smiles. "Oh, it's so nice to see someone taking real pride in their home," she said during my second week here, peeking over the fence line. "Too many of these people let things slide, you know?" That should have been my first clue. Too many of these people. It was the kind of phrase that hides behind civility but reeks of control, a whisper of superiority wearing pearls and a polite smile. I found out later Karen had lived in Maple Hollow Estates since 2008. She wasn't on the original HOA board, but she was the one who revitalized it in 2017 after what she called a period of disorganization. That was her word for it. Other neighbors, quiet ones, called it a power grab. She redrew the HOA guidelines, standardized the font, introduced a mandatory compliance calendar, and created something called the Residential Integrity Committee. She chaired that, of course. Karen didn't just follow the rules, she authored them, and she didn't like gray areas. Everything had to be labeled, measured, approved, and most importantly, controlled. When she first handed me that bylaws packet with the soft smile and clipped tone, I thought she was just neighborly, helpful. Now I realize it was an early warning shot. The first real sign of her shift came the day I caught her walking behind my property. There's a narrow service path that runs behind my fence, mostly used by utility workers checking lines. I was reorganizing my shed when I heard leaves crunch. I looked out and saw her there, standing still, staring through the slats. Not talking, not passing through, just watching. I stepped out. "Everything okay, Karen?" She blinked like I'd startled her, smiled, but it was hollow. "Oh, just out for a walk. I was admiring how organized your shed looks." She tilted her head. "Is that a fire-rated steel door?" I nodded. "Sure is." She paused. "Interesting choice for a residential structure." Then she walked away without another word. The next week, I got the usage declaration notice. After I responded with the facts, code compliance, non-commercial use, everything perfectly legal, I assumed she'd let it go. Reasonable people do. You show them the facts, they back off, right? But Karen isn't reasonable. She's strategic. She didn't reply directly to my letter. Instead, I noticed a new behavior. She began standing at the edge of my driveway during her morning walks, looking at the shed, sometimes taking photos with her phone. Once she even brought a tape measure. And then the letters changed. The language became colder, more legalistic, less about appearance and more about function. Phrases like unauthorized utility occupancy started showing up, and each letter included new language about remedial actions subject to board discretion. But here's the thing, there was no board, at least not in the way she implied. I did some checking. Karen was the vice chair, but the chair had moved to Arizona 6 months ago and hadn't been replaced. The treasurer was her cousin, and the secretary had resigned the previous fall, which meant Karen was running the HOA almost entirely solo, rubber-stamping her own memos and calling it policy. That's when I knew she was manufacturing authority, and that's when she escalated again. She started approaching my neighbors, quietly, but consistently. Patricia and Tom told me she stopped by with a clipboard and asked how often they saw contractors coming to my property. The elderly man next door, whose garage I'd helped fix, said she asked if I was operating a business out of my shed. Rumors started, whispers, soft isolation. Suddenly, people waved a little less. Conversations dried up. I became the guy with the illegal shed, even though nothing about my structure was illegal. And that's the brilliance of Karen's strategy. She didn't need to prove anything. All she had to do was create enough suspicion to isolate me, to turn the neighborhood into silent accomplices. But I wasn't scared. Because I've seen people like Karen before. When you investigate arsons, you learn to read people. The ones who think they're the smartest in the room always overplay their hand. They get bold. They start falsifying reports, doctoring evidence, thinking no one will notice. And just like those suspects, Karen made a mistake. She submitted a property violation summary to the HOA's lawyer, claiming I'd built a secondary structure without permitting, that it was being used to store hazardous mechanical equipment, and that I was operating a non-disclosed contracting service in a residential zone. I got a copy from a friend in municipal enforcement who recognized my name and flagged the filing. That's when I realized she wasn't just posturing anymore. She was building a legal case to have my tools, and possibly the entire shed, removed. The stage was set. She had her rumor mill, her made-up board memos, her falsified narrative. All she needed now was a show of force. And on January 12, 2024, it arrived. 3 men in plain clothing pulled up in a nondescript SUV. One held a clipboard, another had a utility belt that looked cobbled together from surplus gear. The third stayed in the car, engine running. Karen stood on the sidewalk, watching. They claimed to be tool code enforcement, which for the record is not a real agency. They flashed unmarked badges, told me I had 15 minutes to grant them access or they'd file an incident report for obstruction. I asked for their names. They refused. I asked for a department number. They couldn't give one. I asked them which division they worked for under the state licensing board. They went quiet, and that's when I showed them my own credentials, a laminated card issued by the state, sealed, signed, real. I'm Daniel Reyes, Certified Fire Investigator, badge number 409L. I've worked directly with the Attorney General's office. If you boys want to pretend you're enforcement, you're going to need a lot more than cosplay and clipboards. Karen's smile dropped, The man with the clipboard took a step back. The SUV pulled away before the third man could even roll down his window. They were gone in 60 seconds. But I wasn't done, because now I had proof of fraud, of impersonation, and of a conspiracy led by the woman who once smiled and handed me a welcome pack and kit. They were gone in 60 seconds, but I wasn't done, because now I had proof. Proof of fraud, proof of impersonation, proof that Karen Whitlock, vice chair of the Maple Hollow Estates HOA, had orchestrated an illegal attempt to access my property under a fabricated authority, tool code enforcement, a term that exists only in her imagination. But if you think that stopped her, you don't know Karen. When her play-acting officers scattered, I assumed, naively, that this was over, that being exposed would force her to back down, that shame, or at least self-preservation, would do the job. I should have remembered. People like Karen don't retreat. They regroup. Within 72 hours of the incident, I received notice number 6, this time via certified mail. It was labeled, "Failure to Cooperate, Pending Board Adjudication." She had escalated to formal HOA language. She included a bullet point summary of my non-compliance, now reframed as refusal to participate in voluntary resolution protocols. The letter warned of a $150 per day fine for continued obstruction, plus additional administrative recovery costs. Attached was an invoice, $1,050 for the site inspection attempt. Let that sink in. She tried to illegally access my property with 3 unlicensed individuals, and now she was trying to charge me for wasting their time. I refused payment, of course, but the next week, the pressure grew. Neighbors I'd once waved to now avoided eye contact. Tom and Patricia stopped responding to my texts. I saw Karen talking to them from her porch, nodding with that tight-lipped smile, clipboard always in hand. People whispered at the mailbox. I'd catch shutters flickering open, then quickly closed. One morning, I found a note pinned to my front door. "This isn't a construction site. You're making everyone nervous." No signature, no fingerprints, just anonymous hostility. A week later, I received an email, this time from an address labeled MHE Community Safety Board at protonmail.com. That email accused me of harboring volatile tools, operating machinery without community consent, disturbing residential tranquility through industrial energy presence. Industrial energy presence. She wasn't just rewriting rules. She was rebranding reality. On February 10, 2024, I got a formal notice of fine accrual. The document claimed I owed $300 in fines. The number had ballooned from the previous invoice, citing multiple days of non-compliance. But this time, she went further. She notified the HOA's collections partner. I called the listed number. It went straight to voicemail. The outgoing message? A robotic voice. "You have reached the recovery division of Maple Hollow Estates. Leave your parcel number and violation ID." No name. No official state license number, no registered business address. It was a phantom collector, a scarecrow set up to frighten residents into handing over real money. That's when I started digging. I pulled property records, HOA filings, board meeting minutes from the last 5 years. What I found was chilling. There had not been a full HOA election since 2020. The Residential Integrity Committee had never filed meeting logs. Karen's cousin, Glenn Whitlock, listed as treasurer, hadn't lived in the neighborhood since 2019. The email domains used for notices, at protonmail.com, at inboxer.org, were anonymous, encrypted services not authorized for official correspondence under state HOA statutes. This wasn't just micromanagement anymore. This was a shadow government built by one woman with a printer, a clipboard, and a God complex. Around February 18th, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching in my side yard. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out, and caught 2 teenagers ducking behind my shed. One had a phone out, recording. They took off before I could get a clear look, but later that week, I saw snippets of video on the neighborhood message board, edited to make it look like my shed had dangerous wiring. The video was captioned, "Is this what you want next to your kids' bedrooms?" I reported the video to the platform. They removed it, but the damage was done. Karen didn't need proof. She needed fear. And now she'd turned it into a weapon. Then came the community concern petition. A single-page document left in neighbor mailboxes asking residents to support the relocation or removal of industrial hazard equipment from residential zones. No mention of me by name, but my address was listed in the footnote. The HOA had become a mob in cardigans, guided by paranoia, gossip, and one woman's personal vendetta. On March 2, 2024, I received a letter from the State Fire Marshal's Licensing Division. It was an anonymous complaint, alleging that I was engaging in unsanctioned freelance inspections and issuing unauthorized fire assessments in violation of certification limits. False. Every word. But still, when you work in enforcement, even a whisper can derail your license. I had to spend 4 weeks gathering affidavits, work logs, and signed contracts proving I hadn't violated a thing. It didn't just cost me time, it cost me trust from 2 clients who were suddenly reviewing their liability exposure. Karen hadn't just come after my tools, she came after my name. While she applied pressure, I built my case, quietly, systematically. I documented every letter, archived every email, photographed her walking the property line, time-stamped, captured the tool code enforcement visit on my outdoor camera, pulled building permits, showing my shed had been properly filed, inspected, and signed off. I also filed Freedom of Information requests to see if Karen had submitted any official code violations to the city. She hadn't, which meant every accusation she'd leveled, every inspection, every fine, every alleged safety violation had come not from a government entity, but from her clipboard. Her fraud was about to catch up with her. Because on March 15th, I walked into City Hall, sat down with a clerk in the zoning department, and dropped a 34-page folder titled False Enforcement Scheme, HOA Overreach and Forgery in Maple Hollow Estates. Inside were documents, timelines, camera stills, email headers, signature comparisons, cross-referenced bylaws, state statutes. I made 3 copies, one for the city attorney, one for the state housing board, and one for the real fire inspector who now had a fraud investigation to open. Karen thought she could wear me down, but she didn't realize this wasn't just my shed, this was my jurisdiction, and I wasn't going to let her burn this place down with paper lies and fake power. Because fire always leaves a trace, and her trail? It was about to light up the whole street. Because fire always leaves a trace, and her trail? It was about to light up the whole street. The day I filed that folder, False Enforcement Scheme, HOA Overreach and Forgery in Maple Hollow Estates, was the day everything changed. Not on the outside at first. Karen still walked the block like a monarch doing rounds. The notes still came. The silence from neighbors still hung heavy in the air like smoke after a small kitchen fire. But beneath that calm surface, the structure she'd built of lies, of intimidation, of counterfeit power was already smoldering, and I was holding the matchbook. 3 days after my visit to City Hall, I got a call from Trina Holmes, a senior investigator in the Municipal Zoning Compliance Division. I'd included her name on the CC line of my report because I knew she'd handled a few cases involving rogue HOAs misapplying zoning ordinances. "Mr. Reyes," she said, calm but alert, "I read your submission. We're opening a case, quietly for now." Then she paused. "By the way, who the hell is tool code enforcement?" I chuckled. "Someone with a badge printer and no shame." Trina didn't laugh. "That's impersonation of a regulatory agent. That's criminal. We're pulling IP logs and tracing the communications. Don't engage with her directly. We'll handle it." That was the moment I knew I'd crossed the threshold, from defending myself to going on offense. With the city involved, I finally had space to breathe, but I wasn't done building my case. I filed a cease and desist letter through a lawyer friend who specialized in municipal overreach. It cited HOA fraud, libel, unauthorized collection practices, criminal impersonation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet, but it put Karen and her fake board on notice. I sent the letter via certified mail and email. I also CC'd the State Department of Housing Oversight, the Fire Marshal's office, and the HOA's insurance provider, whose contact I'd found buried in a public filing from 2 years ago. I'd learned one thing from investigating electrical fires. It's not the first spark that takes down a building. It's the cascade, the way the system fails when it's forced to face itself. Remember that anonymous complaint Karen filed with the state licensing board? The one that almost cost me my credentials? Turns out every complaint like that, once closed, is publicly documentable. And guess what? The conclusion on record showed no violations found, allegations baseless. I attached that document to a new packet I was preparing, a presentation, because it was time to bring the truth into the light. On March 30th, 2024, Karen sent out a flyer announcing a special HOA community meeting at the Maple Hollow Clubhouse. The flyer was framed in neutral tones, but the intent was clear: to publicly address unresolved violations impacting community safety. I knew what she was doing. She wanted to put me on trial, make a public display, shame me into surrendering. But I had something she didn't: the truth and a USB drive. When I walked into that meeting, about 30 neighbors were there. Foldable chairs, coffee table, cookie tray. Karen was already standing behind a lectern with her binder and her stern, "I didn't want to do this" expression. She opened with a summary of my pattern of resistance, claimed I'd created a hostile environment, pointed at my shed as a symbol of defiance. I stood, calm, silent, wearing a suit, holding a folder. When she tried to move on without allowing questions, I raised my hand. "Mr. Reyes," she said, voice stiff, "this isn't the place." "No," I replied, "this is exactly the place." I stepped to the front and handed a printed packet to each neighbor in the room. The title page read, "Operation Paper Crown, a factual timeline of fraud, fabrication, and HOA overreach in Maple Hollow Estates." Inside were time-stamped photos of Karen behind my fence, copies of every false notice, the fraudulent invoice, the cease and desist letter, public zoning maps, statements from 2 city officials affirming the legality of my shed, a copy of the forged complaint she'd sent to the licensing board. Then I plugged in the USB and played the footage. The 3 men, the fake badges, the confrontation, Karen's presence at the scene. The room was dead silent. You could hear every throat clear, every breath catch. It was Tom, the same neighbor who'd once brought over banana bread, who spoke first. "You mean those fines weren't real?" I nodded. "They weren't just fake. They were illegal, and I'm not the first target, just the last one who didn't back down." Karen tried to interrupt, something about protecting community standards. But the mood had shifted. This wasn't about a shed anymore. This was about abuse of power. Another neighbor stood up. "I had to repaint my house twice because she said it didn't match the pal." "Itty, there is no pallet, is there?" "No," I said, "there isn't." Someone else. "She fined me for having a compost bin." Another voice. "She took my garden gnomes." The meeting fell apart, for her. People talked over each other, demanded receipts, asked about where their fees were going. The illusion cracked, the crown slipped. Karen walked out. Not a word, not a glance. Just the tight click of heels on tile and a door that didn't close fast enough to hide her shame. The next day, I followed up, submitted a formal fraud complaint with the state HOA regulatory board, emailed my folder to a local investigative journalist, provided the city with every bit of footage and testimony they needed, helped organize a petition to call an emergency HOA leadership re-election per our own bylaws. We got the signatures in 3 days. You see, Karen's real power wasn't in the bylaws. It wasn't even in her clipboard. It was in the silence. She thrived because people assumed she had authority, because no one questioned the language in the letters, because the illusion of power, like the illusion of fire, is often more frightening than the thing itself. But I investigate fire for a living, and I know the difference between heat and smoke. Karen had neither. All she had were ashes. Karen had neither. All she had were ashes. But ashes, as any fire investigator will tell you, don't just float away. They stick. They cling to walls, to floors, to the lungs of anyone who breathed them in. They leave behind a residue that whispers what used to be here. And in Maple Hollow Estates, the illusion of power had burned away, leaving only the carbon fingerprint of a woman who tried to rule by fear. Now came the reckoning. It started with 36 signatures. That's all we needed under the HOA bylaws to call a special election. 10% of the homes in our 360 residence community. We got them in 3 days. But by the time we were done, we had 148. People who had remained silent for years came out of the woodwork. They told stories, horror stories. One, man was fined $800 for illegal irrigation pipe visibility. A retired couple had their backyard wind chimes forcibly removed for noise disruption. A single mother got charged $300 because her daughter's bike had been left on the porch. And all of it, every single action, traced back to one person, Karen Whitlock. We submitted the petition to the HOA legal liaison, a real one, appointed during the previous legitimate board, and they set a date for a full community vote, April 17, 2024, a Wednesday night, Maple Hollow Clubhouse, 6 o'clock p.m. But the real showdown started before the vote. In the 2 weeks leading up to the election, the neighborhood transformed. Lawn signs appeared overnight. Vote for real representation. End HOA fraud. Retired or just tired of Karen? Accountability isn't optional. Someone even printed t-shirts that read, "Not today, Karen." It wasn't just protest anymore, it was momentum, it was joy, it was relief. Even Tom and Patricia, once too afraid to make eye contact, approached me with homemade cookies and an apology. "We should have stood up sooner," Tom said, guilt in his voice. "You're the reason we're getting our neighborhood back." I didn't need the cookies, but I took one anyway. Of course, Karen didn't go quietly. The day before the vote, she released a letter to the neighborhood, typed, double-spaced, and dropped in every mailbox. It read like a manifesto. She blamed outside agitators, accused me of falsifying documents, and called the election a coordinated assault on civility. She invoked phrases like traditional values, preserving harmony, and decency in the face of chaos. But no one was buying it anymore. We'd seen her chaos. We'd lived under her false harmony, and the only traditional value we wanted back was democracy. By 5:45 p.m., the Maple Hollow Clubhouse was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Some brought folding chairs. Others stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes locked on the podium. Karen stood at the front of the room, binder in hand, pearl necklace shining under the fluorescence, still in control, still posturing. But the illusion was threadbare now. I watched her scan the room, noticing who wasn't standing with her, noticed the whispers, the stares, the absence of fear. She opened the meeting with a forced smile. "Welcome, neighbors. I know emotions are running high." That's when someone shouted, "You mean the emotions we weren't allowed to have for 5 years?" The room erupted. Laughter, applause, a few quiet tears. Karen tried to regain control, tapping the microphone. But this time, she didn't hold the gavel. Mark Jensen, a quiet software engineer who lived on Chestnut Way, stood and read the petition aloud. He motioned to remove the current board, all of it, and hold emergency elections that night. The crowd approved by voice vote. It wasn't even close. Karen stood frozen. Her lips parted, but no words came. We distributed ballots, counted them in real time. No proxies, no tricks, just pens, paper, and the truth. When it was done, the vote to remove Karen Whitlock from her position as vice chair was 208 in favor, 19 opposed. She was done. Her clipboard, gone. Her binder, useless. Her legacy, paper and smoke. As the newly appointed interim chairperson, a retired city planner named Nora Griffin, took the stage, Karen tried one last move. She stood up. "I've served this community for 17 years, she began. Everything I did was to preserve order, to protect the—" I stood, not to interrupt, but to finish. "To protect yourself, Karen," I said, calm but firm. "You abused your neighbors, falsified documents, faked enforcement. You turned a quiet community into your own private kingdom." And then I said the line that ended it. "And now, the fire's out." In the weeks that followed, we revised the bylaws to require board transparency and third-party audits, removed the fake fines from residents' records, reopened several disputes Karen had buried, reported her to state regulatory authorities for impersonation and HOA fraud. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a soft resignation, but the community chose to pursue full legal review instead. There were consequences. Because even if she walked away, we wouldn't let her walk away clean. The shed still stands. I added a new sign to it, just a small one, etched in brushed steel. Compliant since day one. Neighbors wave again. Tom and Patricia mow their lawn with music on. Kids ride their bikes without fear of rule violations. And I sleep better. Because I know this. The worst fires aren't the ones that burn buildings. They're the ones that burn trust. And the only way to fight a fire like that is to stand in it and refuse to move. And the only way to fight a fire like that is to stand in it and refused to move. Karen was gone. Not just from the HOA board, not just from the meeting room, but within the month from Maple Hollow Estates entirely. Her house was listed discreetly, no open houses, no public showings, just a cryptic, private sale pending tag on the listing sites. A black SUV hauled away boxes late one night, and by the next morning, the shutters were closed, the porch bare, the silence profound. But unlike the many little tyrants who quietly slip away before the dust settles, Karen didn't get to vanish without consequence. Because what she tried to do wasn't just neighborhood bullying, it was impersonation, forgery, fraud. And when I stood in that meeting room and named the fire, I didn't just put it out, I made sure it was investigated. 3 days after the public vote, I submitted a formal criminal complaint to the state. Department of Civic Governance and HOA Oversight. Attached were video and photographic evidence, sworn witness statements from neighbors, the fabricated tool code enforcement badge captures, a record of every fake violation and forged notice, the forged complaint filed against my license. The investigation launched quietly, but thoroughly. And then came the discovery that reframed everything. Karen hadn't acted entirely alone. In the course of the inquiry, a witness came forward. Her name was Delilah Jensen, former secretary of the HOA. Quiet, unassuming, lived 3 blocks away and kept mostly to herself. She'd resigned quietly 2 years earlier, claiming health reasons. But in truth, Karen had threatened her. Delilah had tried to speak out about discrepancies in HOA fines and board spending back in 2022. She'd noticed checks written to non-existent vendors, odd charges labeled security review, and unfiled meeting minutes. When she asked too many questions, Karen told her that non-compliance could affect her property value, and certain permits might be harder to renew. Delilah resigned, but she kept records, emails, voicemails, financial logs Karen assumed had been deleted. She turned them over to the city attorney, and just like that, the story became bigger than my shed. It became municipal fraud. In May 2024, 2 months after Karen's removal, the city launched a joint audit between the zoning department and the HOA oversight office. The findings: $19,172 in unaccounted HOA administrative fees, 4 forged documents sent to the licensing board, 7 fabricated citations against residents, use of fake business accounts tied to shell enforcement groups, including tool code enforcement. Karen was served with a formal notice of civil liability. The city issued a public memo confirming fraudulent activity under her leadership and began exploring criminal charges. It didn't stop there. The HOA's insurance provider, once notified of the situation, refused to cover any of Karen's legal defense costs, citing willful misconduct. She was on her own. Karen tried to file a counterclaim for defamation against the board. It was dismissed in under 3 minutes. Once the dust settled, the new board got to work. We created the Neighborhood Transparency Charter, a binding document requiring all HOA notices to be signed by at least 2 verified board members, fines to be reviewed by an independent community review panel, quarterly open forums where residents could raise concerns without retaliation, a public ledger of all financial decisions, and we did something else too. We issued formal letters of apology, signed and sealed, to every resident who'd received a fraudulent violation or fine under Karen's regime. Fees were refunded, violations struck from records. It was more than paperwork, it was closure. I saw Karen once more before she disappeared entirely. It was early morning, maybe 6:45 a.m. I was walking my property, coffee in hand, when I saw her getting into the SUV. She didn't see me at first, but just before the door shut, her eyes met mine through the windshield. No anger, no spite, just something hollow. Like someone who'd built a palace out of lies and realized, too late, it couldn't shelter her. I didn't wave, but I didn't need to. Because in the end, the most powerful thing you can do to someone like that is take away the control they thought was permanent. It's funny how something as small as a structure can become a symbol. My shed never changed, still steel-framed, still anchored, still painted neutral gray. But now, it's more than a tool shed, it's proof. That lies don't last, that silence can be broken, that community, real community, is stronger than intimidation. And sometimes, the best badge isn't the one they try to flash. It's the one you earn by standing firm. Today, Maple Hollow Estates is quieter in the best way. The new board listens. People talk to each other again. The wind chimes are back. The garden gnomes have returned. And as for me? I spend my mornings tending roses, not writing incident reports. I've taken on a few local fire safety seminars, taught some kids how to spot wiring issues. Nothing big, nothing flashy, just peace. The kind that doesn't come from fake authority, but from the knowledge that you defended your ground, with integrity, with truth, and with the strength to endure the fire. So I ask you, where are you watching from? Have you ever stood up to someone who tried to control you with fear? Have you ever had to fight for something you knew was right, even when everyone else stayed quiet? Tell me in the comments, because silence fuels people like Karen. But stories like ours, they help the next person speak up. And sometimes, that's all it takes to bring the whole house of cards down. If you've ever stood your ground against petty power, whether it was a clipboard tyrant, an overreaching HOA, or someone who mistook silence for surrender, this story was for you. Drop your state or country in the comments. Share your story and let us know what finally made you say enough. Because sometimes the most powerful badge is the truth. Subscribe. Be for more stories like this, real people, and the courage to fight back without ever raising your voice. And remember, you don't need permission to defend your peace, you just need to know your rights and stand tall when it counts. We've got more stories coming. Until then, stay calm, stay smart, and never let fear do the talking.